Wait, don't walk away yet. The words weren't loud, but they cut through the noise of the crowded room. A dozen conversations slowed. Chairs creaked. Someone near the back stopped pouring coffee. At the center of it all, a young man stood frozen beside the door, his hand still on the handle. He had already decided to leave. In fact, he'd been deciding that for the past 20 minutes. He just hadn't expected anyone to notice. The man who spoke sat near the front, calm and still, watching him with an expression that wasn't judgmental, but wasn't soft either. It was honest. "You came all the way here," the man said quietly. "At least hear one sentence before you go." The young man hesitated. People in the room shifted in their seats, some curious, some skeptical. It wasn't a big event, just a small gathering in a quiet community hall on the edge of the city. Folding chairs, warm lights, and a chalkboard with a few words written across it. Bruce Lee. Quotes. Life. Simple. But something about the atmosphere felt heavier than a normal talk. The young man swallowed. His pride told him to leave. His curiosity told him to stay. The man at the front leaned forward slightly. "Most people," he said, "aren't ready for the truth. Not because it's complicated, but because it asks them to change." The room fell quiet. The young man slowly let go of the door. Before this story goes any further, take a second to subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard. He turned back toward the room, and in that small moment, something began that none of them expected. Something that would quietly change the way several people in that room saw their lives, including him. Daniel Rivera hadn't planned on spending his Thursday evening in a community hall listening to quotes from Bruce Lee. 3 hours earlier, he had been sitting in his car outside his apartment building, staring at his phone, wondering how everything in his life had become so stuck. 32 years old, smart enough, hard-working enough. But lately, it felt like nothing moved forward. He'd lost a promotion at work to someone younger. His relationship had ended months earlier. His friends were busy building lives that seemed to have momentum, while his own days felt like they were repeating. Wake up, work, scroll, sleep, repeat. That afternoon, while walking past a small cafe, he noticed a flyer taped to the window. Community Talk Tonight. Bruce Lee quotes that still matter today. Free, for reasons he couldn't fully explain. He tore the little tab with the address and put it in his pocket. Maybe he hoped for something inspiring. Maybe he just wanted to sit somewhere that wasn't his apartment. Now he stood near the back of the room, uncertain if he had made a mistake. The speaker was an older man named Marcus Hale. Not famous, not flashy, just calm. Marcus wasn't pacing the stage like a motivational speaker. He mostly sat on a stool, speaking slowly, as if he were talking to individuals rather than an audience. Bruce Lee once said, Marcus continued, "Knowing is not enough. We must apply. Willing is not enough. We must do." A few people nodded. Daniel crossed his arms. He'd heard quotes before. Everyone had. The internet was full of them. But something about Marcus's tone made them feel less like slogans and more like questions. Marcus scanned the room. "Most people love inspirational quotes," he said, "but very few want to live the truth inside them." Daniel shifted his weight. He wasn't sure why, but the sentence landed a little harder than he expected. He glanced at the door again. Leaving would be easy. Staying might require listening. Marcus didn't rush his words. He spoke like someone who had learned patience the long way. When Bruce Lee talked about self-mastery, he said he wasn't talking about fighting. He was talking about discipline, awareness, responsibility. He stood and wrote a quote slowly on the chalkboard. "Be water, my friend." Several people smiled. It was one of Bruce Lee's most famous lines. Marcus stepped aside. "Everyone loves this quote," he said, "but most people misunderstand it." A man near the front chuckled. "Isn't it about being flexible?" Marcus nodded slightly. "Yes, but it's also about letting go of the things that make you rigid." He paused. Pride, fear, ego. Daniel felt a quiet tension in his chest. Marcus continued. "Water adapts. Water flows. Water doesn't waste time arguing with the shape of the container it's in." A woman raised her hand. "So we should just accept everything?" Marcus smiled gently. No. He leaned against a stool. Water also carves canyons through stone. The room felt thoughtful. Daniel looked at the chalkboard again. Be water. Simple words. But suddenly they felt less like philosophy and more like a challenge. Because if Daniel was honest with himself, he hadn't been adapting lately. He'd been resisting. Resisting disappointment. Resisting change. Resisting the uncomfortable idea that maybe his life needed adjustment. Marcus looked toward the back of the room. Toward Daniel. Sometimes, he said, the hardest thing isn't hearing the truth. He paused. It's realizing the truth might be about us. Daniel looked away, but the thought stayed with him. The talk moved forward slowly, but the room stayed engaged. Marcus didn't flood the audience with dozens of quotes. Instead, he treated each one like a doorway. He wrote another line on the board. Absorb what is useful. Discard what is not. Add what is uniquely your own. Marcus turned back to the group. Bruce Lee said this about martial arts, he explained, but it applies to life just as much. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Marcus continued. Most people spend years copying what everyone else is doing. The same career paths. The same expectations. The same definitions of success. He gestured around the room. And there's nothing wrong with learning from others. Then his tone shifted. But problems begin when we forget to think for ourselves. A man near the back spoke up. So you're saying everyone should just do their own thing? Marcus shook his head. No, I'm saying everyone should understand why they're doing the thing they're doing. The difference felt subtle, but it wasn't small. Daniel felt something stir in his mind. When was the last time he had honestly asked himself that question? Why was he doing the work he did? Why was he chasing the goals he chased? Somewhere along the way, his life had turned into a checklist. Graduate, job, promotion, next step. But lately, the steps had started feeling empty. Marcus glanced around the room again. Bruce Lee believed in personal expression, he said, not imitation. He paused, letting the idea settle, which means the life you're building should actually feel like yours. Daniel sat quietly. For the first time that evening, he wasn't thinking about leaving anymore. He was thinking about something else entirely, whether he had been living someone else's version of success without realizing it. Marcus took a sip of water and looked around the room with calm focus. Let me ask you something, he said. Have you ever realized you were holding yourself back but kept doing it anyway? Several people laughed softly. The honesty of the question broke some of the tension. Marcus smiled. That's one of the strange things about being human, he continued. We often know the right direction, but fear keeps us standing still. Daniel felt the sentence like a quiet echo, because if he was honest, fear had been a quiet companion in his life lately. Fear of failing again. Fear of making the wrong move. Fear of starting over. Marcus walked slowly toward the chalkboard and wrote another quote. If you spend too much time thinking about a thing, you'll never get it done. A few heads nodded immediately. Marcus turned back to them. Bruce Lee understood something important, he said. Action creates clarity. He paused. Thinking alone rarely does. Daniel exhaled slowly. That one stung, because for months he had been doing exactly that. Thinking, analyzing, waiting for the perfect plan, waiting for the perfect timing. But nothing had changed. Marcus's voice softened. Perfection is comfortable. Action is risky. He folded his arms lightly. But growth only lives in one of those places. Daniel looked down at his hands. For the first time in a while, he wasn't blaming his job, his circumstances, or other people. He was considering something else. Maybe the biggest thing standing between him and change had been hesitation. Marcus stepped back toward the stool. Tonight isn't about Bruce Lee, he said quietly. It's about whether you're willing to hear what the words are asking from you. Daniel sat still, because suddenly, the conversation felt less like a lecture and more like a mirror. The room had grown quieter than when the evening began. People weren't checking their phones anymore. Even the faint hum of traffic outside the building felt distant. Marcus sat back on the stool and rested his hands together. Let me tell you something most people don't like hearing, he said calmly. Life rarely changes because we wait for it to. A few people shifted in their chairs. Daniel listened carefully now. Marcus continued. We often imagine that one day motivation will arrive like a wave, that suddenly we'll feel ready, confident, certain. He shook his head slightly. But readiness is usually something we build, not something we receive. Marcus wrote another quote on the board. Do not pray for an easy life. Pray for the strength to endure a difficult one. The chalk made a soft scratch across the board. Daniel stared at the sentence. It wasn't comforting, but it was honest. Marcus turned back to the group. Strength, he said, doesn't come from avoiding pressure. It comes from facing it. A man near the window spoke up. That's easy to say when life's going well. Marcus didn't argue. Instead, he nodded slowly. You're right, he said. It's much harder when things feel uncertain. Then he added something quieter. But those are the moments when our character becomes visible. Daniel felt a strange mix of resistance and recognition, because lately he had been hoping for life to get easier before he made a move, before he tried again, before he risked failing. Marcus leaned forward slightly. The truth is, he said, most breakthroughs begin when someone decides they're tired of waiting. Daniel didn't realize he had leaned forward too, but something about that line lingered longer than the others, because deep down, he knew exactly what Marcus meant. Waiting had become his comfort zone, and maybe that comfort zone had slowly turned into a cage. Marcus stepped away from the board and walked slowly between the rows of chairs, not pacing, just present. Bruce Lee wasn't obsessed with winning, he said. He was obsessed with improvement. Daniel listened closely. Marcus continued. Winning is temporary. Improvement changes who you are. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. So, how do you stay motivated all the time? Marcus smiled gently. You don't. The honesty surprised a few people. You stay disciplined, he said. Motivation comes and goes. Discipline shows up anyway. Daniel felt a quiet weight settle over that sentence. Discipline. It wasn't a glamorous word, but it carried a kind of quiet strength. Marcus returned to the stool. Bruce Lee once said, I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times. He paused. That quote isn't really about fighting. Daniel almost smiled. Marcus continued. It's about commitment, about showing up again and again when nobody is watching. He looked around the room. Success rarely comes from sudden brilliance. It comes from consistent effort. Daniel thought about the past year, about the nights he'd come home tired and distracted, about the ideas he had started and abandoned, about the things he said he wanted to build someday. Someday, Marcus's voice softened. The person you become tomorrow, he said, is shaped by the habits you choose today. Daniel looked down again, not with shame, but with realization, because suddenly the question wasn't why his life felt stuck. The question was whether he had been willing to put in the steady work required to move forward. The evening had shifted. What started as a casual talk now felt more like a quiet reflection shared among strangers. Marcus wiped the chalkboard clean. Let's talk about something uncomfortable, he said. Several people chuckled nervously. Marcus wrote a single word on the board. Ego. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Marcus turned to face the group. Ego, he said calmly, is one of the most powerful forces in our lives. He gestured lightly. It convinces us we're already right, already capable, already deserving. He paused. And sometimes that voice prevents growth. A man crosses arms. So confidence is bad now? Marcus shook his head. No, confidence built on effort is powerful. Then he pointed gently at the word on the board. But ego built on avoidance is dangerous. The room fell quiet again. Marcus continued. Bruce Lee believed in emptying the mind, letting go of unnecessary pride. He leaned slightly against the stool, because when we think we already know everything, we stop learning. Daniel felt something shift inside him, not dramatically, but enough to make him reconsider a few things, like the way he reacted when feedback came at work, or the way he quietly blamed circumstances when things didn't go his way. Marcus looked toward the back again. His gaze briefly met Daniel's. Growth requires humility, he said. Not humiliation. Humility. The difference mattered. Daniel understood that, because humiliation breaks people, but humility opens doors. Marcus erased the board slowly. And the strongest people, he added quietly, are usually the ones still willing to learn. Marcus placed the chalk down and folded his hands. For the rest of the evening, he said, I want to try something different. The room waited. Marcus looked around at the group. We've talked about quotes, ideas, philosophy. He paused. But words are only meaningful if they lead to action. Daniel felt a quiet tension return. Marcus continued. So here's a question for each of you. He let the silence stretch for a moment. What is one thing you know you should start doing but keep avoiding? Several people looked down. The question felt personal. Marcus didn't rush anyone. He simply waited. Finally, someone spoke. I've been meaning to start a business idea. A man said quietly. Another voice followed. I should probably go back to school. A woman added softly. I need to repair a relationship with my sister. The room had changed. The conversation wasn't theoretical anymore. Marcus nodded to each person. Then his gaze landed on Daniel again. You were about to leave earlier, Marcus said calmly. No accusation, just observation. Daniel hesitated. Everyone in the room turned slightly. He wasn't used to speaking in groups. But something about the evening made silence feel dishonest. I guess, Daniel began slowly, I've been avoiding starting over. Marcus tilted his head slightly. In what way? Daniel exhaled. I've been wanting to change careers for a while, but it feels risky. So I keep telling myself I'll figure out later. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Then he said something simple. Later is a comfortable lie. The room grew still again. Daniel didn't feel judged. He felt understood. Marcus continued gently. The moment we're honest about what we're avoiding, that's the moment things can begin to change. Daniel sat quietly, but inside, something important had just shifted, because for the first time in months, the future didn't feel like something happening to him. It felt like something he might choose. After that moment, the atmosphere felt lighter, not easier, just more real. Marcus stepped back toward the chalkboard and wrote another quote. Mistakes are always forgivable if one has the courage to admit them. He turned toward the group. This might be one of Bruce Lee's most underrated ideas, he said. Daniel listened closely. Marcus continued. Failure itself isn't the problem. Avoiding responsibility for failure is. He let the idea settle. Growth begins the moment we stop pretending things are outside our control. Daniel thought about that carefully. For a long time, he had blamed timing, circumstances, luck, and maybe some of those things were real, but they weren't the whole story. Marcus leaned lightly against a stool again. Every person in this room has made mistakes, he said. Every one of us has taken wrong turns. A few people nodded quietly. Marcus smiled slightly. That's not weakness. That's being human. Then his tone grew thoughtful. But courage appears when someone says, that didn't work, so I'm going to learn and try again. Daniel felt a strange sense of relief, because failure had always felt like a verdict, something permanent. But Marcus was talking about it differently, like it was simply part of movement, part of learning, part of becoming better. Marcus looked around the room. The only true failure, he said quietly, is refusing to grow from experience. Daniel sat back slowly. For the first time in a while, his past mistakes didn't feel like chains. They felt more like lessons he hadn't fully studied yet. The evening moved forward with an almost reflective calm. Marcus had stopped writing quotes on the board. Instead, he spoke from memory now. Bruce Lee once said something simple that most people overlook. He began. Daniel waited. Marcus continued. He said, to know oneself is to study oneself in action with another person. A few people looked thoughtful. Marcus explained. It's easy to think we're patient until someone tests our patience. Soft laughter moved through the room. It's easy to believe we're disciplined until we face distractions. Daniel understood the point immediately. Marcus smiled gently. Our character reveals itself in real situations. He paused. Not in our intentions. That sentence carried quiet weight. Daniel thought about how often people, including himself, talked about what they planned to do, what they hoped to become, what they believed about themselves. But Marcus was pointing somewhere else, toward behavior, toward action, toward reality. Marcus looked around the room once more. The person you believe you are, he said calmly, should eventually match the person people experience. The honesty of the statement made the room quiet again. Daniel didn't feel attacked. He felt challenged, and oddly enough encouraged, because if character lived in actions, not words, then change was possible. Not instantly, but gradually, through choices, through effort, through consistency. Marcus finally sat down again. And that, he said quietly, is where real transformation begins. The clock on the wall showed the evening was nearly over, but nobody had stood up yet. Marcus rested his hands together. I want to share one final idea from Bruce Lee, he said. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Marcus spoke slowly. Bruce Lee believed that life itself is a process of constant learning. He gestured toward the group. No one ever truly finishes that process. He smiled softly, and that's a good thing. Daniel felt something settle inside him. For months, he had treated life like a scoreboard. Wins, losses, progress, failure. But Marcus was describing something different. A path, a long one, full of adjustments. Marcus continued, the goal isn't to become perfect. He paused. The goal is to keep becoming. The simplicity of the idea felt strangely comforting. Daniel realized something important. Maybe he didn't need to have his entire future figured out tonight. Maybe he just needed to start moving again, learning, adapting, improving. Marcus looked around the room. The most powerful thing about Bruce Lee's philosophy, he said quietly, is that it gives responsibility back to you. He pointed gently toward the audience. You decide who you become. Daniel sat silently, but inside, something had already begun shifting. Not dramatically, but enough to make tomorrow feel different from yesterday. People began standing slowly. Chairs folded softly. Quiet conversations started between strangers who had shared an unexpectedly meaningful evening. Daniel stayed seated for a moment. Marcus was wiping the chalkboard again. The words were disappearing one by one. Daniel walked toward the front. Marcus noticed him approaching. Leaving already? Marcus asked with a small smile. Daniel laughed lightly. I guess I almost did earlier. Marcus nodded knowingly. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. Can I ask you something? Of course. Daniel looked back toward the emptying room. How do you actually start changing things? Marcus leaned on the stool. He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said something simple. You pick one action. Daniel waited. Marcus continued. Not 10 goals. Not a complete life plan. He held up one finger. One action that moves you closer to the person you want to become. Daniel thought about that. It felt manageable. Real. Marcus added quietly. Then you repeat it tomorrow. Daniel nodded slowly. For the first time in a long while, change didn't feel overwhelming. It felt possible. Small, but possible. Outside, the night air was cool. Daniel walked toward his car slowly. The city felt different. Not because anything had changed around him, but because something had shifted inside him. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment. Instead of scrolling his phone like usual, he opened a notes app. One action. Marcus's words echoed in his mind. Daniel typed a single sentence. Research programs for the career change. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a full plan, but it was movement. For the first time in months, he felt a small sense of direction, and that feeling mattered more than motivation ever had. Weeks passed. Daniel didn't transform overnight, but he started taking small steps, researching, learning, updating skills he had neglected. Some days felt frustrating. Other days felt hopeful, but something important had changed. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was moving, and every time doubt appeared, he remembered something Marcus had said. Action creates clarity. Slowly, Daniel began seeing possibilities he hadn't noticed before. Opportunities, new connections, new confidence. Not because life had become easier, but because he had become more willing to engage with it. Months later, Daniel passed the same cafe where he had first seen the flyer. He paused for a moment. The memory made him smile. Inside the cafe window, a new poster hung on the glass. Another community talk. Another gathering. Daniel realized something quietly powerful. That evening in the small community hall hadn't solved his life. It had simply reminded him that change begins with responsibility, with honesty, with action. Bruce Lee's words hadn't been magic. They had just been truth. And truth, when someone is ready to hear it, can move a life in a completely new direction. Daniel walked down the sidewalk, feeling the steady rhythm of the city around him. Life was still uncertain, still challenging, but now it felt like something he was participating in, not just watching. Sometimes the most powerful words aren't the ones that sound impressive. They're the ones that quietly ask us to become better. And when we finally answer that question, everything begins to move. So now I'm curious. From which part of the country are you watching this story?